She never expected it to happen at 55. Not after raising kids, not after decades of marriage, not after telling herself that the exciting chapters of life were already written. Margaret Lewis believed she understood how her story would end: quiet mornings, polite conversations, and evenings that felt more like habits than moments. That belief shattered on an ordinary afternoon when a single glance changed everything. Margaret stood inside a small community art center in a peaceful Vermont town, organizing papers she had already organized twice. Outside, autumn leaves fell slowly, painting the sidewalk in shades of orange and gold. Inside, the building felt warm but empty, much like her life lately. Volunteering there gave her purpose, or at least something to do that wasn't sitting in a quiet house with a husband who felt more like a roommate. Her marriage to Richard had lasted over 30 years. It wasn't broken in a loud way. There were no fights, no betrayals, no shouting, just silence. Long stretches of silence where feelings used to live. They talked about bills, schedules, weather, and sleep. They didn't talk about dreams anymore. They didn't talk about each other. Margaret had learned to accept it, or so she thought. The door opened behind her, and she turned without interest until she saw him. He looked young, almost out of place, like someone who had taken a wrong turn. Tall, with kind eyes and an unsure smile. He hesitated at the doorway, then stepped inside, scanning the room as if checking whether he belonged there. "Hi," he said, his voice calm but careful. "Is this the volunteer meeting?" Margaret nodded. "You're in the right place." Their eyes met, and something strange happened. Not fireworks, not excitement, just a deep, quiet awareness. The kind that settles in your chest before your mind has time to argue. His name was Ethan Parker, 24 years old. Originally from Canada, he had moved to the U.S. temporarily for work and was helping with local programs while figuring out his next step. He spoke politely, listened closely, and thanked people for small things others ignored. Margaret told herself not to notice. She reminded herself of her age, her ring, her responsibilities. She focused on the clipboard, the schedule, the sound of her own voice explaining rules she had explained many times before. But she noticed anyway. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became a regular presence. He arrived early, he stayed late. He helped without being asked. He never rushed conversations, even short ones. When Margaret spoke, he looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. That alone unsettled her. They talked about simple things at first. The weather, the town, its adjustment to life in the States. She learned he missed his family, especially his mother. He learned Margaret had once dreamed of traveling, but never quite found the right time. Their conversations were innocent, but the feeling beneath them was not. Margaret felt awake in a way she hadn't felt in years. She laughed more. She paid attention to her appearance again. She caught herself smiling while driving home, then quickly felt guilty. At home, nothing changed. Richard still sat in his chair each evening, watching television. They still ate dinner together in silence. But Margaret felt different, and that difference made the silence louder. One night, as she washed dishes, she realized she was thinking about Ethan's laugh. The thought startled her. She turned off the water and stood still, her heart beating faster than it should. "This is wrong," she whispered to herself. She tried to pull away after that. She skipped one volunteer day. She avoided long conversations. She kept her answers short. She told herself this was just attention, and attention fades. But when she returned the following week, Ethan noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. She nodded too fast. "Just busy." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. But the concern didn't leave his eyes. The shift made things worse instead of better. The tension hung between them, unspoken but strong. Margaret felt it every time he walked into the room. Every time he said her name. One evening, after a late event, the building emptied quickly. Margaret found herself locking up with Ethan. The halls were quiet. Their footsteps echoed softly. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. The sky was dark, the air cold. They stood near the door longer than necessary. "Margaret," Ethan said, then stopped. She looked at him. "Yes." He hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Are you happy?" The question hit her like a sudden wind. No one had asked her that in years. Not her husband, not her friends, not even herself. She opened her mouth to give the expected answer, then closed it. The truth came out before she could stop it. "I don't know," she said. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't offer advice. He simply nodded as if her answer mattered. "That makes sense?" he said quietly. They stood there saying nothing else. But everything had been said. Margaret drove home in silence. When she pulled into her driveway, she didn't get out right away. She sat in her car and cried, covering her mouth so no one would hear. She wasn't crying because of Ethan. She was crying because of herself, because she had realized how empty she felt and how long she had felt that way. Inside the house, Richard was already asleep. Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening over and over. She knew she was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something she never planned to face. The next days moved quickly. She tried to focus on routine, grocery shopping, cleaning, cooking meals no one really tasted. But her mind kept drifting. Back to that question, "Are you happy?" At the art center, their conversations remained careful, but the bond between them deepened. They spoke about fear, about time passing, about the strange paths life takes. Ethan never crossed a line. That somehow made it harder. Margaret began to realize the truth she had been avoiding. This wasn't about age. It wasn't even about Ethan. It was about being seen, about feeling alive, about remembering that her heart still worked. One afternoon, she caught her reflection in a window and barely recognized herself. Not because she looked older, but because she looked awake. That night at dinner, Richard talked about a work issue. Margaret listened, nodded, and suddenly felt a deep sadness settle in her chest. Not anger, just grief. For all the conversations they never had. For all the chances they missed. She went to bed early and lay awake, knowing something had already changed. She didn't know where this path would lead. She didn't know how much it would hurt. All she knew was that the life she had accepted no longer fit. And the most frightening part was this. She wasn't sure she wanted it to. She knew the moment she woke up that nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret stared at the ceiling of the guest room, the early morning light cutting through the curtains. Her heart felt heavy, but her mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. Something had begun, and pretending otherwise would only make it worse. She was standing between the life she knew and a truth she could no longer ignore. At breakfast, Richard spoke about traffic and deadlines. Margaret listened, nodded, and realized how distant she felt from the sound of his voice. There was no anger in her chest, only a quiet understanding. Whatever they had once been, it was no longer alive. Later that day, she drove to the art center with her hands tight on the steering wheel. She told herself she would keep things normal, polite, professional, safe. But when she saw Ethan standing near the front desk, something in her expression must have changed, because he noticed right away. "Hey," he said softly, "you okay?" She hesitated. "Can we talk?" They stepped outside, the cold air sharp and honest. The town moved around them, unaware of the weight in that small space between two people. "This can't keep going like this," Margaret said. "Whatever this is," Ethan nodded. "I know. I'm married," she continued, "and I never meant for my heart to wander." "I didn't mean for it either," he said quickly. "I don't want to cause pain." That was the moment. Margaret understood something important. This wasn't a fantasy built on selfish desire. It was real because it came with fear, responsibility, and consequences. "I need to figure out my life," she said, without lies. Ethan looked at her for a long second. I respect that. Whatever you decide." That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She replayed her life in pieces: her wedding day, the birth of her children, the long years of doing what was expected. She realized she had slowly disappeared while trying to keep everything else steady. In the morning, she made a decision she had been avoiding for years. She told Richard the truth. Not every detail, not every feeling, but enough to be honest. She told him she felt lonely, that she felt unseen, that she had formed an emotional connection with someone else, and that it scared her. Richard didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He sat very still, his hands folded in front of him. "I didn't know you were this unhappy," he said finally. "I didn't either," Margaret replied. The words hung between them, heavy but real. They talked for hours. About mistakes, about distance, about how love can fade when no one is paying attention. Richard admitted he had grown comfortable and stopped trying. Margaret admitted she stopped speaking up. There were tears, but no shouting. Pain, but also respect. "We can try counseling," Richard said, "or we can be honest and accept that. Something has changed." Margaret closed her eyes. "I don't think I can go back to pretending." They decided to separate slowly and carefully. No lawyers at first. No anger. Just space to breathe. When Margaret told Ethan what happened, his face showed both relief and sadness. "I didn't want to be the reason," he said. "You weren't," she replied. "You were the mirror." They met for coffee a week later. In a quiet cafe this time, the air felt different. It was no longer an escape. It was simply a person who mattered. "I don't expect anything from you," Ethan said. "You've been through a lot." Margaret smiled gently. "So have you." They talked openly, honestly, about age, about reality, about how feelings don't always lead to forever. Ethan was clear. He wasn't asking her to build a life around him. He wasn't offering promises he couldn't keep. That honesty made the connection feel even more real. Over the next few months, Margaret focused on herself. She moved into a small apartment. Nearby, she reconnected with friends she had slowly drifted from. She started walking in the mornings, not to stay young, but to feel present. Ethan remained part of her life, but not at the center of it. They talked, shared thoughts, laughed. Sometimes there was longing, sometimes there was distance. Both were necessary. Then one evening, Ethan told her the truth he had been holding back. "My program is ending," he said. "I'm going back." To Canada. Margaret felt the familiar ache, but this time it didn't break her. "I know," she said softly. They met one last time at the same art center where it all began. The building was quiet, the leaves had fallen, winter was close. "I'll always be grateful for you," Ethan said. "You've changed how I see connection." "You reminded me I was still alive," Margaret replied. They didn't promise to wait. They didn't speak of forever. They hugged, long and steady, and then let go. Months passed. Margaret finalized her separation from Richard with peace, not regret. They remained respectful, connected by history, but no longer bound by silence. Ethan sent occasional messages from Canada, simple updates, friendly words. No expectations. Margaret didn't chase youth. She didn't regret loving someone younger. She understood now that the real story wasn't about age or infidelity. It was about awakening. At 55, she learned that honesty matters more than comfort. That desire isn't shameful when handled with care. That choosing yourself doesn't mean destroying others. One evening, as she sat by her window watching the snow fall, Margaret smiled, not because of what she lost, but because of what she found herself.